a self-imposed limit.
Yes. Yeah.
Or not limit, but thing that we have to do, and we don't have to do it. If we want to record a 15-minute episode, that's the slop that the pigs will have to eat.
Well, thanks for listening, folks.
Yeah. Anyway, individualism. It's dialectical. Moving on.
Great.
Oh,
well,
dear. Well,
we've gone from not doing this for about a month to doing it twice in a week.
Now we can't stop.
Yeah. Can't stop podcasting. Can't stop. Won't stop.
Can't stop. Don't want to stop. For the royal listener, we're banking this one because I'm in the process of moving. By the time this episode comes out, I will already have moved, and I'm just like, moving sucks so much fucking ass that I'm just like, oh my god, I'm stressed. There's gonna be a million things to do, so we're banking them again, which I feel like all we do is bank them now. Yeah. What are you gonna do? So by the time this comes out, I will be in Ireland living my best life. So ahoy, or whatever they say. I don't know. Oh god, I'm stressed.
I think it's going to be great, but
it's going to be great.
We just got to go and find out.
Going to be great. Going to be so great. So to date this is the day directly after America's Most Holy Day, which was the Super Bowl. And do you know a little bit about American football?
I suppose I know a little bit about American football. I watched half of the highlights and then got bored, but that's more about my attention span than anything else. I do know what happened.
Okay.
Good. Well done, Philadelphia.
Well done, Philadelphia. It was probably the worst Super Bowl game of all time. Yes, what are you going to do? It was Philadelphia.
In what regard?
Just because it, like, if it weren't for the last few minutes, it almost would have been a 40-0 blowout.
Because I watched the highlights and then stopped halfway through, and it was like 20-0 or something, or 25-0, and
a lot of cutting to Taylor Swift looking very upset, which we don't like to see. This is a pro Taylor Swift podcast.
You don't get that in the YouTube highlights. So.
Yeah, you don't. You know what else you don't get in the YouTube highlights is the dude in the middle of the halftime show who was one of Kendrick Lamar's dancers holding up a Palestine flag and a Sudan like kind of solidarity flag, jumping on top of the car. Fucking sick. So cool. Then immediately he just gets this. Okay. The Super Bowl is evil for a million reasons, not the least of which because it's just like everything that is just like so comically memeable about America. But Kendrick Lamar being like the first line of his performance was something like, "The revolution's about to be televised, baby." And then it's like this dude makes the most minor like act of protest for an ongoing like horrible genocide, 2 horrible genocides, and it's just like immediately gets the shit kicked out of him by like 7 beefed up security guards. It's like, well, if we wanted a image of how America's doing and what America's like, it would probably be that, the most minor form of protest and just immediate state apparatus, repressive state apparatus, just beating the shit out of our guy, which you don't like to see. So
I don't get it. I don't know whether it's like repression in the form of just like pure spectacular excessiveness, or whether they seriously think it's a serious boogeyman that they're afraid of. That revolution really is imminent.
I don't know. I think about that a lot because I think about like cops and why they're such assholes. Because it's like, on one hand, you expect cops to be assholes, but you don't expect them to have like Punisher tattoos and be as like cringe as they are. You know what I mean? And like so many cops like believe what they're doing is right, and like it's this weird kind of like masculinity thing, but it's also like, I don't think it really would make sense to be like, cops think of themselves as the upholders of capitalism or the upholders of private property, or even like the upholders of like a white order, right? A like racist white nationalist order. Like, I don't know. It's a weird one. It's like maybe they see themselves as upholding a specific kind of order that is just whatever it is in their head. And that order we know is defined by private property and by racism and, oppression and all these things. But to them, it's just like the status quo. It's like, why are you going to get a Punisher tattoo for the status quo? Why are you going to beat the shit out of some guy holding like a Palestine flag for like the status quo? It's like, you're an asshole. What is that? I don't get it.
Yeah, I don't understand. Such excess, though, isn't it? It's just
is. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it's some pseudo Zizekian comment would be about.
We'll get Zizek on the podcast. Yeah. This is where I need a Zizek soundbite for the soundboard, but all we have is Bookchin, sadly. Anyway, Super Bowl aside, well done, Philadelphia. We all know that your sports fans deserve it. Yeah, I don't really care about American football, so even if an LA team was in the Super Bowl, wouldn't have really cared. Pitchers and catchers are reporting to duty this week, Dan. That's the real sport that we all care about. Baseball's right around the corner. So we'll have plenty of updates from the general cartel of the Los Angeles Dodgers for me. In the meantime, Dan.
Didn't baseball just finish?
Yes, baseball. Like... There's too much baseball. I'll be the first to admit it. I'm the number one baseball guy. There's too much baseball. There are 162 games. That's way too many.
Talk about inexplicable excessive enjoyment. You know?
Hey, I'm fine with it.
What's going on?
Every day there's a game. I'm like, cool.
It's vulgar, Jog.
Yeah. Are you still? Are you also chose this week's reading? Is this a reaction to you saying that you were blackpilled from still us reading like the ultra left, like red riot stuff? Because we're back to anarchism. Why don't you introduce?
I mean, it was an accident in some respects. Like the I don't know whether, anyway the guy the guy that the person that runs the bookshop where I bought the book for last week's reading said that he'd read this essay and told me about it in relatively neutral terms, I think, just as the only thing that he'd read by that author. And I was like, well, that sounds good. That sounds interesting. It's got a suitably provocative title. Let's go with that. It's short. I suggested to Jack, see what happens.
There you go.
You know, here we are. So, you know, there's no grand scheme. There's no like intelligent choice being made. There's no sort of like detailed research to what would be the best complement to our building the auxiliary statements corpus. No,
yeah,
it's just
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I appreciate the bookstore guy recommending this. Yeah, we haven't done anarchism in a while, and it's a bit of a whiplash from us going ultra left, whiplash to the social democracy stuff, and then now we're like full anarchism. But I'm on board.
And well, it's like you know, it's the auxiliary statement swirling the drain, and we're just getting closer and closer. So we're just like repeating the same point more and more often. You know? It's the spiral of the dialectic spirals. Coming to its
tighter spirals. It's like, you know, the contradictions are tightening. But yeah, what was the name of this? It was, I just pulled it out to read it. It was Anti-Individualistic Individuality, Anarchism's Legacy, Gabriel Kuhn, who did the translation and wrote one of the essays for, what you said, the book on Austro-Marxism that we did for the last episode. And yeah, I mean, when we read his essays on the Austro-Marxism stuff and about the culture stuff there, I think we were both kind of impressed by his commentary on Austro-Marxism. And again, I think I said in the last episode that it kind of behooves Austro-Marxism in a surprising way to be discussed by an anarchist. And so it's cool when you suggested this one. I was like, yeah, right on. Let's read some more anarchism stuff.
It's like, it's impressive that he was willing to. One of the things we said last week, that although he's quite he's very forward and honest in his commentary, he's also like, he looks past a lot of the potential anarchist criticisms of that form of potentially conformist behavior. And this essay is the other side of that spectrum. You know, it's sort of like a full-blooded defense of some more key anarchist principles, in a way that I think we're probably going to get quite a lot out of, or overlaps quite a lot with our political understanding, or what we're striving to understand. So,
yeah, I think if this ties into kind of anything that we've read, it's probably some of the like systems theory stuff, because he is kind of asking some questions that are kind of some of the key fundamental questions of systems theory and like cybernetics and a lot of kind of management theory kind of stuff, just about like, because I guess, you know, the general gist of the essay is how do you encourage individualism in a collective society, but then also the flip side of that is how do you encourage collective politics in an individualized society. So it's basically like, how do we all come together under capitalism, and then under socialism, communism, anarchism, whatever, like how do we maintain our individuality? And again, I think this is a subject that lends itself to be written about by an anarchist, because this, like, you know, anytime Marxists try to talk about culture, it always, to me, kind of comes across as a bit cringe, because it's just kind of banging on the same drum. And whether or not it's correct about, you know, I don't know, you like Lord of the Rings, well, here's why that's fascist or whatever. Here's why it's the mode of production. Like, anarchists are much more interested in like culture and counterculture. And counterculture and anti-authority are like, that's where you start. If you want to be a Marxist, if you want to be an anarchist, if you want to be anything like an egalitarian of some sort, like, to me, you got to start there. You got to start from, wow, there's something deeply sick about the society that we live in, and finding healthy creative outlets to develop a kind of anti-authoritarian attitude and engage in whatever counterculture scene it is that you appreciate, even if that's entirely on your own or with a community, I think is like a much better place to start for an egalitarian politics than, coming across like Lukács when you're studying like politics or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not hassling people that do that, but it's like, I think your politics will always be much more moral and much more ethical if you were someone that starts from like a deep-seated mistrust of this sick society than a like, pushing your glasses up your nose. Well, here's why value theory is all correct, right?
Yeah. I mean, this essay ends with kind of like a short exposition of some of the contradictions in that kind of like, the dangers of I suppose, a performative connection to identity or subculture or group, which I often feel like I see, which sort of anarchist communities or forms of culture that are heavily associated with anarchist aesthetics seem to like skirt quite close to a kind of like individualist performance of a aesthetic.
What's the
Rather than
Bookchin
like,
book? What's the Bookchin book where he got all grumpy and he was angry at the end of his life? Oh fuck, what's it called?
a
It's like
lifestylist anarchism, and
like exactly, yeah, it's that.
yeah,
Absolutely.
it's the lifestylist anarchism.
Lifestyle anarchism.
Lifestylist versus class struggle anarchism.
Yeah, versus me, I'm right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and again, that's kind of why, if we wanted to pit those two things as opposite poles, which I don't think you need to do, which is to say, one, which is a very like scientific approach to capitalism and a scientific approach to socialism, versus a kind of more emotional, gut-based reaction and kind of counterculture attitude. I suppose you could say that both of those things need each other, and you're kind of not really going to develop one without the other. Because again, as you're saying, yeah, you're absolutely right to say like a purely aesthetics based revulsion to capitalism will inevitably lead to cringe, but more importantly, like, yeah, just like there's no real basis to it, and a kind of nihilism too, if we're being honest, because it's like you're not interested in developing these critiques.
And it lends itself toward those aspects of capitalist society and culture that this essay is trying to critique, right? The kind of like defending one's individualistic right to ultimately to consume and to accumulate and to exploit, at its apogee, but like at the most basic level, just to sort of consume items that fit in with your chosen and ascribed aesthetic or whatever. That it's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, maybe we'll get into it later, but like it's interesting. What you say, like the I mean, I guess the parallel to coming at this from the standpoint of like, is there a distinction between the kind of like maybe ultra scientific theoretical approach to critique and to imagining the new society and how it's going to function, and there's that pole, I suppose, which is quite easily associated perhaps with Marxism and a form of Marxism that can in some ways, or would be criticized by this essay as potentially skirting closer toward forms of authoritarianism and forms of like anti-individuality thinking, and in some respects, like we could think of like systems theory approaches to how are people going to function in societies, in collectives, in economic and social situations. How are we going to organize those sort of collective endeavors so that they're both collective but also support the individual, but also allow for the individual's collective working together. And then this is in some ways is like a very personal. In some ways, it's a very moral, prescriptive definition of how to advance individuality in a communalist setting. And so I suppose as we go through this, like looking for a synthesis between like this sort of like this essay is sort of like skirting toward a sort of prescriptive behavior building approach rather than what we might sometimes think of as like a systemic, an approach that comes from the perspective of system. Might be an interesting way to approach this, and how we try and synthesize this essay with like some of the systems theory approaches that we may have taken in the past, or things that we've read about in that way. I think. Don't know if that makes any sense.
No, definitely. It's interesting because I think he introduces this essay by saying that he's really disappointed in post-structuralism, which I think is very funny, and postmodernism. And
I mean, it's worth saying in the introduction to this, he sort of says this is a republication of an essay that he wrote in the like late 90s when he was like a late teen or in his early 20s or something. So yeah, it's sort of like full of references to postmodernism, post-structuralism, the failures of postmodernism.
And Ice-T.
Yes.
Ice-T gets a citation.
I mean, like, I don't know how I feel about the cultural references in this. Like in some ways, like it's nice to pick figures and make Ice-T and Henry Rollins intellectuals in the same way as like Murray Bookchin and not Bookchin. Who does he quote in this?
Like
Bakunin and
Malatesta.
Enrico Malatesta and whoever else. So, but at the same time, it feels very kind of like pop theory at the same time, you know?
Yeah. It's like, as a wise man once said, I don't give a fuck, dude. Like, that's not actually the essay, but it's kind of funny.
No.
But yeah, it's interesting. And it was very refreshing to have someone who was like, I loved postmodernism and I loved post-structuralism, but then I read too much of it and was just like, this sucks. Like, because basically his critique is that, and this is only really developed in one of the footnotes, but he's basically trying to make the point that like postmodernism and post-structuralism, mainly like postmodernism, really falls victim to exactly what it's trying to critique in a very lazy way. And they kind of encourage this kind of individuality, which is in essence just entirely bourgeois, right? Like they really try to, make this point that the individual is the key and that, this all around development of the human being or whatever. But at the end of the day, without any kind of like modernist truth to it, right? It's or modernist like searching for that truth, which for Marx, right, was like a working political economy of capitalism. It just becomes bourgeois. It just becomes tools of consumerism and tools of just capitalism in general. And he parallels that with like a criticism of like libertarians, which I thought was really, really clever. And it's incredibly easy to see how libertarians fall into this trap, right? Like they rail against the state, and they rail against this, and they rail against that, and all these forms of authority, failing to actually see that, the real thing that is actually exploiting you and domineering over you, it isn't like an individual capitalist, it's the social relations of capitalism. And so if you just try to, smash the state or whatever and develop this kind of bourgeois idealism of the individual, which is, that the bourgeois promise of picking yourself up by your bootstraps and, being the king of your own suburban domain or whatever, like that's just going to fall back on the very things that are exploiting you. That is just what capitalism is. So if you destroy the state, it's like, well, you can't really do that under capitalism. You just create chaos, right? You just create like a capitalism that doesn't have the thing to save it that it needs. It's like, this is the reason that you hear libertarians, talk about like child labor and shit like that. It's like, yeah, okay, guys, yeah, you got this theory of the individual really, really put together. But it's interesting to kind of compare that to postmodernism and stuff. It was a very kind of apt critique, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I had something I wanted to say and I've forgotten it, so I've lost my train of thought. I wonder whether maybe just explaining the distinction that's contained in the title might be a good way to sort of like start off approaching some of the content of this, because it's like he's talking about anti-individualist individualism. He's trying to present he's trying to champion a theory that he's calling anti-individualist individualism. And it's quite an obvious, I suppose, distinction that he's making, which I'm going to slip up on multiple times because I've just used the wrong, I'll say individualist or individualism rather than individuality or the individual or whatever. But I think it's just like individualism is the word that he's associating with that kind of like bourgeois championing of the self, the consumptive sort of like the Homo economicus theory of the individual, who like anyway, yeah, as opposed to a form of individuality which he thinks is the thing to be defended, is the thing that's going to flourish in communal and collective settings, and you can create communal and connective systems which champion and allow for the flourishing of individuality. So yeah, individualistic behavior bad, individuality good, I suppose.
Yeah, and this is exactly, and this is kind of one of the main critiques you get, like that anarchists level at a lot of Marxists, rightfully so, I think. Not necessarily at Marx, and Gabriel Kuhn here takes pains to like defend Marx on this front, but a lot of the like fears of communism are that it's just going to fall back on a kind of like, you know, whenever you read anything about like Trotsky or obviously Stalin, you know, discussing what it is that they think the working class should become, it's like this, you know, army of people that does as they're told to, you know, benefit the totality of society, which is, you know, I guess just like war and industry or something like that. And so it's a very like kind of anti-authoritarian defense of Marx and of egalitarian politics to basically make the distinction that, which is what you're saying, which is that like in these societies, in these classless societies, the kind of first thing we need to be thinking about is like, how is it that you defend individualism and defend people's rights to, well, not rights, but like their ability to flourish, I suppose. And this is where we kind of get into some of the stuff that is like, I think really important to social organizing and to kind of like economic planning and stuff like that, which is that these things, the kind of goals of society and the individualism that he's talking about here, one would imagine in a classless society, those have a bit of a, dare I say, Dan, dialectical relationship, which is to basically just say, you need to be developing a society where the flourishing of the individual is good and is what is needed for the flourishing of society, right? We've spoken about this before, where it's like, on one hand, communism is kind of, you know, trying to develop a society where people acting in their own best interests and developing themselves as humans as they see fit is what is required of society. You really want to tie those two things together, right? And that doesn't mean everybody going to the factory for 12 hours a day. That doesn't mean everybody, you know, I don't know, learning how to like do one job for the rest of their life. What it actually means is something very similar to what we discussed with Roger way back when we actually spoke about like on the ground workplace organizing. It's kind of like an all around development of human capabilities and human skills. And this is like directly from Marx. To Marx, this was kind of the point of communism. It was to create a society where human flourishing is not only encouraged, it's actually required, right? This is the like hunter fisherman schmuck thing that we always talk about. Like, you want people to be able to have the opportunity to do whatever it is that they want and to see themselves as individuals helping society. And you want that to be a choice, right? You want to give them the freedom to flourish, as opposed to being told, here's job complex, here's what you have to do, right? It's like, no, you want to encourage that flourishing, because another word for that flourishing is just the creative potential of humanity, which has been bottled up ever since we've had class, right? So yeah, creative potential. Yeah. That's what we want.
Yeah, it has a individuality like has a positive content for socialist and communist society. It's not, as you say, like it's not, as you say, like ultimate communism would be everybody subsumes themselves to like being like, it's funny because I fall into this trap of sometimes talking about like human beings being sort of one social body, one social organism, like, and to some extent that's true, right? But like if that's the society, this is a form of society that, if that's a true description of at least some aspects of what we might be striving for in the effort to bring about a socialist or communist society, fundamental for that is also the full flourishing of individuals and their ability to participate and to contribute to that society. And yeah, it's a positive feature of communism, is the flourishing of the individual. And at the same time, that flourishing can only come about in a society which respects everybody and looks for and anticipates the positive content and the essential contribution of every person to making a society like that function. So.
Yeah. And, you know, the reason I brought up what we said with Roger was just to kind of mention, like, when we read about the Volvo plant in Uddevalla or Gothenburg, wherever it was, where they realized that, you know, and this is a very bourgeois reason for wanting to do this, but they realized that if you got rid of the kind of Fordist assembly line stuff and you actually kind of had your workers develop an all-around knowledge of creating the final product, which kind of would have been unthinkable 30, 40, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And you really develop them to not just be, I'm the person that puts the reverse mirror on all of the windshields of every car. It's like, no, I'm the person that knows kind of how to do everything in the car, and you work as little teams in doing that. That's a very bourgeois example of kind of this kind of creative flourishing. And obviously, you know, they were producing cars for the market. They were producing cars that probably people didn't need for a bunch of different things. And there wasn't actually creative control over the final product or what it would mean to the, you know, broader social goals of society, which is kind of the main contradiction that Gabriel Kuhn is talking about here. But it's kind of an example. It's like this individualism, the relationship that that has with society is one where you, first of all, give people the opportunities to do whatever they want to do, and you really make an effort to develop the skills necessary to be an all-around kind of like person. Because yeah, you know, it's the thing about like how many Einsteins have died in the coal mine, right? It's like I oftentimes think about just how, you know, insane a society would be in a good way to where everybody has a like at least a working knowledge of the economy around them and of like the broader productive apparatus that we're just totally alienated from. That would just be like, oh my god, if we I'd just fucking go to the moon whenever you wanted to, you know what I mean? If people were that smart, if everybody had that capability. It's a pretty tantalizing thought and a good argument for yeah, communism.
Yeah. And I mean that also brings up a really important point, I think, it's an interesting point to consider, is that like it's not the case what's being presented here, nor is it true that like capitalism is all about individuality, and like the best thing for capitalism is the most ruthless like interaction between individuals and their sort of self-serving nature. Like nor is it the case, as we say, that like under communism the individual will disappear, but like it's present and emergent in the contradictions of capitalism, that even in that simple case, like it's positive, as we've seen in some discussions that we've had about the sort of Toyota production method, right? Like there is some recognition in capitalist settings that it is positive to, like I suppose the language that we could use is like increase the variety of the production and decision making system by extending some decision making power, some creative input to every person on the assembly line, every person who's interacting with a production method. Now that's an emergent quality which is fettered in a lot of ways by the fundamental tenets of a capitalist economy. But I mean, obviously, but we're not saying there isn't some sort of like strict statement being made about like the qualities of a communist economy and the qualities of a capitalist one, but like the interrelation between the two, or like in some ways how one is emergent from the other at the same time as being in contradiction with it, I guess.
Well, I think that's a really, really good point that you bring up, because like from what I gather from my very limited knowledge of these things, there's a very big difference between the Toyota production system on paper and the Toyota production system as it's actually practiced in a capitalist economy. Just like the Volvo production plants I was talking about, they don't exist anymore. They've gone back to factory lines because, you know, it's exactly like what you're saying. Like, capitalists have realized that the fetters of capitalism are making themselves known more and more every day. And as you say, like, they're going to want to create production lines where they increase variety and, you know, increase decision making powers for people kind of on the shop floor, and to kind of encourage this creativity for people that are actually involved in the, you know, kind of practical concrete work that goes into production lines. But it just can't be realized due to capitalist social relations, right? It can't be realized because we live in a class society. And, you know, you kind of have to have that separation between not just mental and manual labor, but the kind of fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is, you know, exchange and use value. So, yeah, man.
Yeah, right on. There is in this essay, I think, the makings of like quite a succinct critique of liberalism, and there is an extent to which, like, so far as I understand, Marxism, Marxist contemporary social democrats can sort of fall into the trap of casting themselves as the ultimate defenders of like liberal rights, and there's an interesting contradiction here drawn out in that sort of like language as well. The example of the libertarian is a sort of like, is that thing taken to its nth degree, right? Like, imagining the libertarian as the pure defender of right, but only so that they can further their own selfish end. It's an appeal to the collective, but a collective defense of individual right, kind of thing. And I think, according to Gabriel Kuhn, there's a contradiction there, right? Like, making an appeal to the liberal state to exist purely to allow you to sort of fulfill your selfish wants, kind of thing. And I think also there's a cautionary tale for socialists, progressives, or whatever, to be wary of thinking themselves as sort of the inheritors of liberalism in some respects, like, without recognizing that there is contradiction in that there's potentials in sort of like 19th century liberalism and 18th century liberalism and whatever, but it came about to create the circumstances for the advent of capitalism that sort of created the individual as a subject so that they could be imagined to relate abstractly through relations of or relations facilitated through commodity exchange and nothing else, to allow for, in some ways, like the obscuring of the class distinction, but between, like, obscure the reality of class behind the sort of facade of equal parties in a sort of like bounded economic exchange, kind of thing. So I don't sort of
kid wants a job. A kid wants a job. I want to hire the kid. What's the matter with the kid working in the factory? It's an equal exchange.
Yeah, well, there we go. Jack's affinity for child labor.
Yeah, listen, I reread the critique of the Gotha program again.
Yeah. Marx is for it, so
yeah, exactly. No, but when Marx is doing it, it's funny.
He's being accelerationist.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, like, you know, it's the subtitle of the book, right? It's Capital. It's a critique of political economy, right? It's like, I think you're definitely right to say that people should be wary of kind of trying to, you know, fulfill the dream that can never be realized of, you know, the bourgeois promise of, you know, and you can succeed and you can succeed and you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Because it's like, even if you do become a capitalist, it's still a class society. There's still millions, billions of people who are going to be working for people like you, right? Like, yeah, don't know if that's a mantle that we necessarily need to take on a mantle. Does that make sense? I don't know. Whatever, you know what I'm saying.
Pick up the torch, you know.
Yeah, the torch, the mantle, the crown. And it's good when we talk about kind of like how this stuff applies to the future society. There's an interesting part in this where Gabriel Kuhn is kind of like, you know, people, like, how does individualism really operate in a communist society? Well, people have to be really active, and they have to be really active in their society in order to kind of make it as they see fit. Which, you know, I suppose to a certain extent is true. I don't know. Every now and then, like, I heard somebody it might have actually been Roger again on the Discord, be like, you know, whenever people talk about like communist utopias, it just sounds like hell for introverts. That kind of just made me think about this. It's like, what if you just can't be fucked? What if you don't really, you'll have your say at work, you'll have your say at whatever, but you don't really want to be involved in like the massive planning body? Now, I don't think that's actually what Gabriel Kuhn is saying here. Let the big computer do it. It's the worst that could happen. But it's interesting. I mean, it raises an interesting question about like agency and how you kind of plan for agency. Because this is kind of like an anarchist essay, the question of like how you plan for these things and how you kind of engineer this society isn't really there. And I don't really want to make it, come across as like we need to like technocratically like create the communist society, because once you have these social relations in place, everything's kind of just gonna, I'm gonna say everything's just gonna work itself out from there, because I can't be bothered to think about the superstructure now. But like, you know what I mean? Like the most important thing is having communal social relations in place. And like this question of agency in communism or anarchism or whatever, I think is really interesting, because it's like, to what extent will you just going about your daily business as you see fit not amount to like a type of agency in communism, and not amount to a kind of like contribution? Because like, I think that is kind of the society that we're trying to create, where it's like the general structure of society is one where if you just kind of go to your job or whatever and engage with people, that counts as being active. It's not necessarily one where it's like you have to constantly be, and maybe I'm not doing Gabriel Kuhn credit here, but it's not one where you kind of have to be, at all the community meetings every week and you have to kind of stand up and give an impassioned speech. It's like, so what I'm trying to say is like, once you get those social relations in place, it's going to kind of be baked into the cake, your agency, because your agency is just you being an individual in a society that values your input. I don't know if I'm really saying anything that makes sense, but that's kind of just the way I think about it. Maybe it's just useless.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, that's the contradiction that we were hinting at beforehand, right? It's the kind of like the almost sort of like moralistic tenor of this, or like it's presenting a prescriptive ethics for how individuals ought to conduct themselves. Like, I mean, it's written like there's a point in the middle of this where it's just like 7 points for how to sort of like do how to act such that you can use your fulfilling your individuality to also benefit the collective, kind of thing. And I mean, it's the bit of this that chimes with a sort of like systems theory understanding of sort of like communism as the harnessing of the collective variety of the proletariat to meet sort of challenges of the economy, of human development and communist society, blah blah blah, whatever. But in some ways, it reads like a 7 commandments of like how to be a good person, like have self-respect and like understand yourself, and like
make your bed.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of that, isn't there? There's a little bit of that. And in some way, and like some of these are things which are like, all of them maybe could be considered to be things that are would be emergent from a system. So again, it's this contradiction that we're hinting at. You can read it from both ways, and it's a fair critique to say like communists in the past have imagined, let's get the system in place, and the system will create the new individuals, or do we need to find practices within capitalism for the that will create the individuals that will live the social relations? You're saying like the social relations will that's not necessarily what you're saying, but there's a way of listening to what you're saying, like the social relations will create the individuals that do this, and like to say one or the other comes first is probably an incorrect way to look at it. But there's definitely a way you can read this and imagine yourself like the I don't know what the right word is, almost the kind of like the libertarian version of a communist, like I will be the ultimate apogee, I'll be the platonic ideal of the communist citizen by fulfilling these like tenets to their fullest, I don't know. Yeah.
We need communist Jordan Peterson, Dan. That's what we need.
I mean, maybe we'll do. Maybe we do. You know. But yeah,
I hate that shit so much.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there's like, as I guess there's a reason why I keep saying there's a moralistic tenet to this. Like, there's a way that you could be very self-critical, or there's a way that someone could be critical of you as a member of the anarchist collective, kind of thing. You know, like this could lend itself very easily to like heavy self-criticism. You know, or like struggle
When's that ever
sessions and the
happened
like.
in an anarchist collective? That's never happened.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, and I think that leads us really in a well said way into kind of the first question that he poses in this essay, which is like, which doesn't really get expanded on too much. Maybe it's kind of what you're saying, the kind of 7 lessons for life or whatever. It's like, how do you build a collective communal politics in an individualized world? Because that's now where it's the reverse of what we've been talking about this whole time, right? It's like, how do you break these bonds where everybody's alienated and looking out for themselves, and even like workers are in competition for work and competition for wages, all these different things, like where everybody's pit against themselves? How is it that you actually create these communal, this seems to be saying communal values, but also obviously like a communal politics and communal structures around us? And that I'm like really glad that we read his and Julius Deutsch's stuff on the Austro-Marxism, like cultural politics that they had, were, you know, really trying to turn the workers' movement into a cultural movement, right? Before this, because in a lot of ways, that's kind of like how you don't want to do it. And like not Julius Kuhn, not Gabriel Deutsch, Gabriel Kuhn in that essay, kind of right before all of Julius Deutsch's essays, talks about how one of the main failings of Austro-Marxism was to have this kind of authoritarian approach to cultural building. And it's basically the opposite of what he's saying in this essay, which is like, you know, you don't want to create, you know, drone workers where everybody is this kind of Platonic ideal. But that kind of is what wound up happening in this Austrian attempt to kind of build a communal politics in this incredibly isolated world. They bought everybody together to form these communal structures, which were mainly kind of, you know, dominated by kind of like an anti-fascist politics, and not necessarily like an explicitly utopian, like communist one or anarchist one or something like that. But unfortunately, like they kind of set fairly strict parameters for what the ideal, you know, communal politics should be, even down to like what the ideal person should be, and talking about how they use their bodies and what they ingest and things like that. So that's very much not what Gabriel Kuhn is saying. That would be the opposite. Gabriel Kuhn is definitely like, you know, don't do that. But it is still an interesting question, and one that is left fairly open here about like, you know, how is it that you bring these communal values? You know, you really do hold on to the fact that there are real values that, you know, people should have, without kind of dictating too hard about what those are, and how, you know, the question that I immediately have is like, who's deciding what those values actually are? Is there a way to build structures in a capitalist society where those values are just like naturally emergent from those structures themselves? Maybe. It's kind of hard to imagine that. But yeah, it's a type of utopianism that I really appreciate, and again, one that gets talked about more in anarchist circles than in, you know, explicitly like Marxisty kind of ones, which is a shame.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very much an open question, isn't it? I don't really know what the answer is. He seems to be. Well, I was trying to imagine constructing some kind of joke about like sort of dropping out the '60s counterculture, sort of drop out. Don't work. I was thinking
Californian
back to
ideology.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's one of the things that, yeah, it does really resonate with this in some respects, isn't it? It's just like he's trying at the end very much to champion the maverick, the sort of person with the countercultural spirit, and then that's the bit at the end of this essay that ends up like in my mind sets off all of the alarm bells about lifestylist anarchism, I guess. It's just like now he's trying to champion, as a result of having given us these sort of like points on how to do this potentially correctly, you know, how a collective might function that also celebrates the individual and why that's necessary. He's trying to present a form of countercultural behavior which is sort of like non negative, non-performist, non-individualist. But there's a real contradiction there. There's a real, well, it skirts very close to what it's trying very hard to not be. Maybe in some respects, I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe
well,
I didn't. Yeah. Maybe I didn't really think over the idea as well enough, or work out hard enough what it was that he was trying to say, rather than just like imagine that he was like trying to tell us we all just need to be beatniks or crust punks or something.
Yeah, man, crust punks. Never trust a crust punk. I've always said that. I don't know. I kind of feel like the individual morals that you need to be a functioning anarchist, communist, socialist are just like help people, go to where people are struggling, help them, and try and maintain a scientific understanding of the world around you. Do you need anything more than that? You know what I mean? It's like when you start really dictating, like, what about when you think about, like, I don't know. It's like, embrace counterculture. Don't be a prick. I mean, maybe none of this is enough. Maybe this isn't really even what Gabriel Kuhn is saying, but like when people do start to dictate like individual attributes that one should have, it's like, yeah.
Well, I mean, it has to start with care and respect for others and the differences, you know, like,
exactly. Yeah.
As soon as the way you try and define yourself becomes in some way about defining yourself against or in opposition to others. Now, you can be in opposition to some particular set of ideas, you know, you can be in opposition to some political opponent, I suppose, but like leaving at least the possibility, the scope for understanding and dialogue it is an essential thing. I think respect for the other is an essential thing. I mean, we're all trying to overcome that sort of like inescapable chasm between us, you know, between like, you know, you never know another person fully. So like, anyway, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it's like trying to maintain that weird boundary of like, here are some things that I think everybody should be like without going too far. You know what I mean? But care and respect for other people, that's like a fairly, you know, basic. It's like, I think we can hopefully expect that of other people.
Expect them to be open to maybe. It. Yeah. But it does get a lot, like, it's very easy for all politics to set themselves in opposition to something in totality, you know, like, or purely to be defined in negative terms as being in opposition, even if that's very laudable and positive in that you're opposed to something fundamentally bad, even evil, you know, like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, this is like, a lot of people probably aren't going to listen to you if you don't have some kind of positive utopia, you know what I mean? Which, yeah. I do think he's very wise to make the point in this as well, that like most socialists kind of think this stuff is just going to work itself out. Because it probably isn't. I know that I was just, you know, went on a thing about like do the easy thing of implementing completely different social relations globally and it'll all be fine. But like, this is something that needs to be considered in planning circles, council circles, and like all aspects of society. Is like, just remember what the goal of all of this is, right? It's the creative flourishing of the individual and the totality of, you know, society and of the global whole, the communal whole. How you get both of those things to kind of live in not discordance. I said crestpunk and I was thinking of discordance axis, accordance. God, how you basically get, you know, the emergent totality of the whole to, you know, coexist peacefully and get along with the goals of the individual, and how you encourage the individual to do whatever it is that they want, and how you balance people doing whatever it is that they want with a functioning society. That's kind of the point. The point is creative flourishing. And that does tend to get lost in the weeds quite a bit, especially in kind of like like red green circles, which fair enough, just because I think, you know, we're facing such a catastrophe that the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, like those really lend themselves very well to people sitting on their brains and being like, this is what we need to do. Listen to me. Holy fuck, please God. Everybody just needs to do this. But yeah, you know, we're here for the morals. It's like, you know, I think Marx being like fervently like in all of his writing, like, no, I'm not doing this because it's morally right. I'm not French. What do you think? I'm a French socialist? Come on. I'm doing this because it's scientific and right. I do think that that's kind of poisoned some people's brains. So, because it is morally right. So, what are you gonna do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Morals are cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I guess. Yeah, I'm just thinking now that like it's kind of like you can set up the perfect system, but people are still going to have to choose to behave in that way, or going to have to behave in accordance with that. And I suppose that the question is then like the question between utopian and scientific approaches to being a revolutionary. I guess like there is also a danger in this of sort of utopian thinking of like we will somehow, not that this isn't imagining there's a huge amount of work to do, but like in some way we'll be able to jump to the point where everybody's living in whatever this essay's imagining of a anarchist collective is, I suppose, and overlooking some of the sort of like developmental requirements that are going to have to happen to get us to this point of like communist utopia, I guess. That's not saying that kind of logic and thinking isn't evident in what Kuhn is saying, you know, but like I'm not saying he's being a utopian, but like you could, if you took only the moralistic prescriptive elements of this, fall into a form of utopianism, I think.
Yeah, it is definitely much easier said than done, especially when I think we all tend to, when we're kind of discussing a transition to communism. I'm definitely guilty of this in this conversation of just kind of assuming, oh, it's just going to, well, tomorrow we'll have communism. There's going to be a mass revolutionary movement. Then we're going to have communism and we can decide society as we see fit. We can design it. It's going to be perfect and everything's going to be in harmony. But million things that are pointing towards that probably not being the case, and there being a transition.
Not be possible.
Yeah, well, let's not go there. Let's leave it as a definite possibility.
Okay.
Just perhaps a massive collapse. Not even a collapse. Not even a collapse. Just like, I don't know. We lost all the bees. Now how are we going to do communism? We've lost all the glaciers. Ireland is now a tundra. You know what I mean? Like, we do not design these things in the way that we see fit, even if there were to be a mass revolutionary movement tomorrow, which probably not. Mm-hmm. You know, never say never, but probably not. So, yeah. Again, the reason I bring that up is to just kind of say that like that is going to be the time in that transitionary phase where you really need to be keeping this stuff in mind. You know, because like, be interested to know. Like, I'm really interested in a way that I never thought I would be when we kind of talk about subject-object stuff and about, you know, the relationships between two seemingly opposed things. And it would be interesting to read some kind of like stuff about how that relates to like guerrilla movements, military movements, things like that. I get the feeling there are a billion anarchist recommendations we can get on this topic about like, you know, designing the perfect anarchist non-hierarchical guerrilla group. But it's funny because you always hear socialists kind of talk about, you know, I don't know, apologizing for like in various civil wars that have happened, like, you know, trying to, you know, keeping the Soviets, but maintaining strict, you know, discipline with like martial law and, you know, like death penalties for soldiers that desert in the military, right? It's like, I don't think you really want to do that. It'd be interesting to kind of see how you could, in one of the most seemingly necessarily hierarchical institutions, maybe that's just bourgeois brain rot, but how you can kind of maintain this kind of individuality and creative flourishing.
I saw he had a quote from somebody who'd written something about urban guerrillerism. I couldn't work out whether it was the same person that we read on the philosophy of the urban guerrilla or whether it was somebody else.
I don't think it was, although I do forget that guy's name.
I can't remember his name either. No.
That was the coolest reading we've ever done. That was pretty cool. He's like, look, if the boss doesn't want to give in to the striker's demands, just kidnap his son. It's like, wow, all right. Yeah, I forget that guy's name. Abraham something. Gian, maybe. Abraham Gian, yes, I don't know.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Well,
Jack,
we almost made it to an hour.
Yeah. We can pad it out.
We could pad it out. Yeah, I don't know.
4 more minutes.
4 more minutes. I don't know if I have anything else. That we could expand on the libertarian critique though, because that was very funny. Just him basically being like, this is just the apotheosis of stupid bourgeois bullshit of just like trying to deliver on the bourgeois promise of everybody being quote unquote equal, and equal rights for everybody, which we all just know is equal rights for people to exploit other people and for exploitation to be baked into the system. And his engagement with libertarianism seems to come from a kind of like, I don't know if it necessarily comes from like Althusser, but it's kind of like this Althusserian kind of like, you know, the cops, that's a state. The military, that's a state. Your mom and dad telling you when bedtime is happening, that's a state. You know what I mean? Where it's like everything is a state. Everything that reproduces the ideology and functions of capitalism is like a state of some kind. There's a lot of railing against the state in this. And he just did a very good job of like distancing himself from the other very loud vocal camp that likes to rail against quote unquote the state. Although they do literally just mean the state, which is just like, you know, libertarian, like Bitcoin guys.
Yes.
Like, I don't know.
It really gets you out of the sort of horseshoe
yes.
of the two libertarian camps, you know, like libertarian anarchism. If you want to find sort of like quite a succinct distinction made between libertarian capitalism and libertarian anarchism, it is in this. And it, yeah, like he's his critique of libertarian is almost calling it out for like, what are you really defending? You know, you're like you claim to be championing the liberty of the individual, but like there is a sort of like totality of liberty that you're seeking to undermine. You know, you're seeking to empower yourself to be able to undermine other people's freedom and liberty and rights. So yeah, it's quite
and at the same time
way of making sort of demonstrating its hollowness, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, it's like, you know, the freedom of other, again, it's just exactly what it's the freedom of people to exploit other people. It's like, how is that freedom? It's like, oh, if only, you know, the robber barons could run the world. It's just like, oh my God. So like American libertarians aren't real. Sometimes I'm just like, this just can't be real. This can't be a real ideology. But there are so many people that buy into it, and so many like liberals that just kind of think this. Again, because I guess in their own way, like, you know, your kind of run of the mill, like college grad liberal will kind of buy into a lot of the same bullshit about perfecting capitalism or about removing certain fetters of capitalism. But yeah,
I sort of presume American libertarianism has been largely subsumed into MAGA Trumpism, has it? Or
I guess so. Yeah. Insofar as it was ever really a distinct like faction separate from the Republican Party. I don't know.
Had no real content in and of itself, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Tea Party bullshit. It's just like, oh my God. I mean, I'm like
another age. What another age that was.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh God. Yeah. Do you remember the famous video from a few election cycles ago? I hate to think of how long ago it was now, but it was like where they were like the presidential debates for the nominee for the Libertarian Party, and it was like Gary Johnson, who was always going to be the guy, like had to go up against just like the biggest neckbeards on the planet. Not saying he's not a neckbeard, but like these were guys who were like, "What's wait? You want me to have a license for a car? What's next? A license to put toast in my toaster?" And everybody in the audience is like, "Woohoo!"
I mean, it's the same as the moment in time when all of the sort of like YouTube men's rights activists subsume themselves into like the UKIP party in the UK. It was just
how does that's so evil?
Or like weird and horrible moment in time.
Do you remember when
not that we don't live in horrible times?
Oh yeah. Well, now
I mean, I suppose the horribleness of the times are becoming clearer, whereas before,
yeah. Now all of those people just like, you know, have seats in Donald Trump's cabinet.
Yeah. Remember when there was a time Sargon of Akkad minister for.
Oh, Christ. Don't even say that's just gonna happen. It's just gonna have Dan Bilzerian, Secretary of fucking Transport. Yeah. It's funny, it's that kind of because there was definitely a period of time, I feel like it was when I was kind of in middle school, where it was like libertarian ideas were kind of seen as somewhat progressive and like almost in the same camp as like Ben and Jerry's Vermont types. Not Bookchin Vermont types by any means. But it's kind of a similar thing with like internet atheism. You know what I mean? It's like loads of those guys now are just like, they make their money not by like owning, you know, evangelical Christians and Westboro Baptist Church people. They're just like misogynists. It's just like, what? It's like
It's all just a grift, isn't it? I mean,
it's all a grift. They're all just algorithm chasing. That's all it is. Yeah, God. God. Ever since we read the population kind of demographics essay, and you were like, I was kind of like, God, we're so cursed to be alive in like this one specific moment in time, and you're like, well, statistically speaking, like, of course we would be alive at this moment in time. I'm still just like, this is the stupidest time, though. I don't want to be alive at this time. It's so stupid. Anyway, people know that. People know that things are stupid. Anyways, all right. Well, by the time this comes out, I'll be living in Ireland. That's exciting and stressful.
Jack's gonna join me in the Celtic fringe of the Great British Isles, I guess.
Yeah, we'll be doing our next episode in Cornish, and then the one after that, we'll be doing it in Irish Gaelic. So, it'll be great. All right. Well, Dan, this was a pleasure. Yep. I look forward to doing it again very soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. It's been a good one.
See ya. Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.